Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 2 with Paul Perfrement, our in-house wizard. Welcome back, Paul.
Thank you, Kelly, and great to be here again with you today.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad to have you back again so quickly. It's like a wizard, magic. There you are.
Yes, everybody. This is actually the same day, and I am wearing the same shirt. That's right.
Look, we thought we would roll on into part 2 because we both feel that it would be great to talk about archetypes and the shadow self and just to go into a bit more depth. But before we do that, maybe, Paul, you can talk just a little bit more about what you do.
Okay. All right, thanks, Kelly. My background was, and my initial training was as a transpersonal counsellor. Eventually, later, I trained in body therapy, like somatic psychotherapy, and became a registered psychologist. At that time, and during my own inner journey, which had quite a lot of features to it, I spent time personally with Dr. Stan Grof and Christina Grof, the main teachers of consciousness in the West, with Michael Hana, the main teacher of shamanism, who was personally responsible for the resurgence of shamanism in the West, and was the founder with his wife Sandra, who was also my teacher, of the Foundation for Shamanic Studies in California, the most well-regarded teaching center for shamanism in the West.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I spent time with John Mack, the individual that personally wrote the books Abduction and the books around focusing on dealing with the issues of connection with extraterrestrials and things like that. He was a Harvard psychiatrist. So these are some of the people that I've spent time with. My work as a psychologist, I was the first person in Australia to bring together shamanism as shamanic journeys in clinical practice, and started to use a lot of the work of Dr. Stan Grof and Christina Grof in the work of making a differential diagnosis between brief first episode psychosis and spiritual emergence. Is somebody in a transformation, or do they have a mental health problem?
Yeah. Sure.
So my job was to educate professionals and to supervise others professionally in that sort of field. Eventually I left psychology because it was very limiting to what my embrace of my own work was. And with Steph, my wife, and I, we now run 2 accredited diplomas, one in soul-centered counselling and the other one in transpersonal psychodynamics and integrated spirituality. And that's basically about how to bring consciousness work together with a authentic spiritual journey that's not bypassing your own real development.
And we touched on that in the first interview. So people who are watching this, please feel welcome to maybe start with part 1 and then come back across to this one, because Paul goes into that in more depth. So today we're going to focus on archetypes, and I'll just start with a little bit of a definition. I went into Caroline Myss's, or Myss, however you'd like to pronounce her name. Some people pronounce it Myss. I go in between Myss.
Yeah, sometimes I say Myss.
Myss, they do too. It's Myss. Yeah. So I might stick with Myss today.
Okay.
But she says archetypes are the psychic lens through which we view ourselves and the world around us. She also says that discovering your archetypes is like being introduced to yourself at a soul level. And so, Paul, I'll ask you if you agree with what Caroline says.
Well, it's a beautiful way to put it, don't you think?
I do. It does resonate with me. It resonates with my soul. Yes.
Yeah.
But do you believe that they are the keys to personal power, by understanding and unraveling your archetypes or identifying them?
Well, I'd say they're the keys to what I'd call transpersonal power. Personal power tends to be more about, in normal literature, the ego or our personality. and the soul is more about the realm beyond the persona, beyond the ego, and yet inclusive of it. So one of the beautiful things about archetypes is that they actually do connect us to those realms beyond ordinary awareness, and yet they are there all the time in how we're being, whether in the feminine one is a maiden, or the crone, or the goddess feeling of the sense of self coming through, or whether you're dealing with challenges and confronted by certain trickster figures or shapeshifters, or let's say the hero archetype. They're just there. And that's the amazing thing. These great teachers like Joseph Campbell and Jung, and who of course coined the term archetype, they really recognized that these remarkable levels of what it means to be human are there, interfacing with our nature and the way we're experiencing ourselves and others every day. And it makes the whole picture much bigger, much richer in how to view life and how to view who we are. Yeah, our own identity. Yeah.
And so it's almost like we're gathering our true selves by understanding our different archetypes, would you say?
Yeah, look, the main work I'm aware of around it was a book by Moore and Gillette, which was called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, or Queen, Warrior, Magician, Lover for the feminine. There's sort of a correspondence in the archetypes anyway. And that encapsulated what Jung considered to be all the main forces into those four. And from their point of view, and there's been a lot of neuropsychological research fitting in with this too, these are patterns of development along which we all grow. Yeah, so we grow from an immature form of an archetype and integrate the shadow dimensions of it, and then we become more whole by integrating a combination of archetypes that constellate as the whole soul identity, which we also call the self.
So would you say that we have maybe 4 main archetypes, and then we start to identify more as we grow and move forward into maturity? And I was also going to ask you, do you believe that we come in with some specific archetypes and yeah, this is where it's getting interesting, or do we just develop them all as we grow up in our dysfunctional or functional families?
Yeah, wow. The first part of that, can you just give me that again?
Do you think that we're actually born with
Okay,
4 or 5 main archetypes?
Okay, yeah, the question about the 4.
Like customized to our soul, let's say, who we are.
I think that we all have our work in our development that fits with that sense of the 4 primary archetypes that Moore and Gillette constellated around the work of Jung. And you could say that all the different features of the other types fit well within that model, right? So, you know, if we're talking about the child or whatever, that it does fit within that model, and it fits within the whole model of human development, like dealing with the persona, dealing with the shadow, which themselves are archetypes as well, and dealing with all kinds of experiences of spirituality. They're archetypal experiences. So the whole scope of how do we define an archetype? It's almost like beautifully put by Carolyn Myss, where it's like, it is that lens, right? One way to understand human development in terms of the archetypes, as you're saying there, is to see that as we become more aware in our total consciousness, which was the ego consciousness, the totality of our awareness, the ego kind of becomes more aware and more expansive, and we embrace more and more ideas or sense of archetypes that I'd say are different specific features of the 4 of Moore and Gillette. And they could fit well. Like I, for instance, felt very drawn in my life on one level to the sense of, well, I suppose the orphaned child in some sense, but also very much the shaman figure. But the shaman classically isn't considered an archetype. It's considered to be a feature of the magician archetype. So, we're splitting hairs here a little bit, but just for clarity, it's like some people like to view the model of there just being four, because Jung viewed that it's like we have the soul actually has certain shape or structure, and those four archetypes fit to constellate the whole self. Yeah, the integration of those four. And then all the other ones we come across, they would easily and simply fit in some sense into that model as well. That's a little restrictive for some people. I mean, Carolyn Myss's beautiful cards that she's done and other work around the archetypes, I think brought archetypes to life for many of us.
Yeah.
Rather than Jung's work. That was an issue for Jung. He found it hard to popularize his work. And people like Carolyn Myss have done a beautiful job of bringing the archetypes through to people. And people just get it. It's like, yeah, they can see that they're that kind of person that carries that kind of energy. Yeah.
Well,
sometimes when I'm in session, sorry, but
no,
just to say,
keep going, Paul.
sometimes when I'm in session, I'm looking at a person. It's like you just watch these different presentations of the self roll through. I'm having an ordinary conversation with them, and I'm watching all these different presentations of archetypes.
Yeah, right.
And it seems like, to me, I'm seeing different relevances of presentations of patterns of development that are significant for that soul as to why they're talking with me.
Might be interesting. Yeah. I'll ask you while you're on that point, maybe just as an example, what archetype am I carrying right now?
Well, well,
I don't mind if you share.
Yeah, well, there's certainly the archetype of the goddess, in the fact that the goddess there is a bringer of life, and a carrier of connection to spirit. And your work is so much related to that. I mean, if we get shamanic about it, we've just had a little informal conversation a moment ago, haven't we, before we started, about the sense of the cat,
yes.
that feline energy of the cat. And that's so present. And there are many different elements of different cat animals there with you, not just one, but quite a lot. I mean, if we had an interactive audience, it would be phenomenal to hear the different archetypes that they're seeing in you, because it's like we're also being mirrored back our own when we look at certain people. Yeah. And so there's a priestess energy there in you, right? The goddess energy that I see in you is very much that priestess energy. Yeah. Which, in terms of the model, would fit with the magician. Yeah. And that energy is somebody who is able to bring through the energy of what they're dealing with, because they're capable of connecting with it in a way where they're able to work in a creative way with the specifics of matters. So as an interviewer, I can see that you do that. Now, looking at your other presentations, they're there in how you work. The wizard certainly is that magician, the priestess, the seer, somebody who's connected to another realm and is able to use that to ground that in this realm.
You might like to touch on also the shadow side of that magician or goddess or wizard, because I think we all need to recognize that, we can fall into that trap, once we move into ego.
Yeah, and these times are full of shadow. One of the great things that Edgar Cayce had to say, that great seer and teacher, was that in this time, many of the souls that are experiencing a deep involvement in the world are having to make, or have made, core decisions about their use of power. They seem to come from places like Atlantis. They seem to have access to great force of power and use of power. And they're either using it in a deconstructive way, you could say in a shadow way, in the sense of not in the Jungian sense of the word, but in the sense of it being a disowned, that's Jungian, I suppose, to some degree, but disowned way, where their power is not being used for what it's meant to be used for, which is good, yeah, or for the emergence of greater consciousness in a authentic and visible sense. So I think that there's a lot of misuse of power in this time, in a shadow sense of the word, of manipulative, and not being prepared to be visible in what your true motives are and in how you're using power. Right? So that to me is where we're experiencing issues with shadow in what we might say is the collective field of our world, our social and global situation, and also with the emergence of ourselves individually, stepping into, coming into an awakened self involves integrating those disowned energies that may be beautiful, may be gifts, or they may be energies that are less palatable to us or others, and that we need to integrate. And by integrating them, they're not necessarily the way they're looked at or experienced in ourselves prior to their integration. The shadow form may be too powerful for an individual or too strong for a person. When it gets integrated, it's much more like you've had a homeopathic dose of it. It kind of brings you into a greater sense of who you really are. And that's what our archetypes do. They bring us into a greater sense of who we really are. Whether it's a positive aspect of ourselves, a gift that we're afraid of coming into and being in our life, or a force in ourselves that's sort of become shut down and needs to be brought through so that it comes into a more positive form or more complete form.
So it's almost like, once again, the gathering of the whole, creating healing environment. How would you facilitate somebody to understand their archetypes and what they're carrying? Would it just be assisting them to recognize it? I mean, there's mythology, isn't there? You could be sort of living out your life through a story, through fantasy, for whatever reason, maybe even as a coping strategy, which is why things may be falling apart, because it's not a true reality. So how would you facilitate that in someone that was living in a fantasy world, Paul?
In a fantasy world? Do you mean by fantasy world like not
mythical? Let's say. Well, I might give you an example. Let's say it's a relationship, and you've got a young lady who has been brought up reading fairy tales, and she thinks that she's going to meet her knight in shining armor, and she's going to have this wonderful wedding and 3 children, 2.5 children, and live happily ever after.
Oh, isn't that what happens?
Yeah.
And the 2.5 children is a bit difficult. They should just like 2 or 3. But apart from that, is there anything wrong with that myth? It's the myth of romantic love. And we have a great problem with it in the West.
Some resent that she never really fulfills her true life purpose, and then the partner goes off and starts drinking, and then she starts drinking, or then there's the initial romance of the love dance. That's what I call it. I think Caroline Myss calls it something else. I think she calls it magnetic something. Let me see if I can find it here on my notes. She calls it, yes, magnetic attraction, whereas I just call it the romance of the love dance.
Yeah. And your question was?
Let's go back to it. We're carrying probably, there's toxicity there. There's archetypes that are misunderstood. There's shadow parts going on. There's labels. We've got all of these things happening, and so I guess a question, because then we've got to differentiate. Is that a label? Is that shadow? Is that an archetype that I need to explore? I think people can then get a little bit confused about, where to start when they're in these toxic relationships. Sorry, it's probably a bit much to answer that one in a nutshell.
For fear of answering it a little bit like my response in our last talk, it's always about where is the individual and what are they experiencing. We have to come back to where is somebody and what are they in touch with, and helping that to open up. I mean, in terms of these love myths, I mean, I remember a story where Jung had one of his clients was quite clear that they were marrying, they would get married. And Jung had such faith in the work that he just continued to work with her as if, you know, the wedding was going to happen from her point of view. And it was only a very short time before the actual date. And she came in on that particular session, and as I seem to recall it, which may be not quite accurate, but effectively she indicated that they wouldn't be getting married. So I think archetypes in their shadow form, they resolve themselves, you know, if they're given the right care and attention. It's a little bit like any of our issues, really. If we are given a safe place where trust can be present and somebody can be stable with what is taking place, then whatever the archetypes are that are presenting can get integrated. Yeah.
I guess the question is, if somebody doesn't have a therapist such as yourself and they're just doing some work on themselves, the first place to start to recognise if there are some shadowy selves there playing out, would it be just mindfulness?
Mindfulness is not really a practice for integration. It's a practice for getting distance from what's taking place in order to feel some sense of self again. But it's not actually helping people to feel what's going on in order to be confronted by the content of their unconscious. It's actually a technique for getting distance from the presentations of what's emerging, because in a sense it's considered to be either, depending on the individual and the view of the person using it, it's something more like witnessing rather than allowing the unconscious to come through and to be related with. Yeah. So the archetypes are presentations of material that in some way is coming from the unconscious, and in particular the collective unconscious, because they're patterns we can all relate to, and they've come down through ancient time, and they have a great power to them. When we want to help somebody an individual's not got a therapist and they want to come to terms with a certain archetype, they relate toward it. They have a genuine and authentic relationship with the archetype and a felt experience of it, so that they get very real with that archetype and yet maintain a sense of who they are at the same time as they relate with it. That's a creative work. I mean, Jung found that his best way to do it was what became known as active imagination, which is basically a technique of being with yourself, seeing what you want to say to that archetype, and then noting that down, and then take a breath, relax, come into the sense of the symbol or the felt image of that archetype and see what it has to say. Maybe one sentence, 2 sentences, not too much. Let go of that, come back to write that down, come back to self, and do this alternate movement where you still have a solid sense of self that's relating to that material, and you're giving plenty of room, little steps by little step, so that archetype also becomes known. And that is how we can begin to work towards integration. You know, of course, none of this is clinically telling people what exactly to do, or that it's enough for them to work an issue through. But if people are having trouble and they want to try to begin to do something, as long as they can keep enough distance from the archetype and come back to self and relate, with continuing to keep some connection with self and working the feelings through that emerge and the images through that emerge, they're going to kind of move along. Yeah, they'll move forward in what is actually their soul process or their psychological experience of the archetype.
Yeah, I remember in my early 30s, I was a solo parent, and I had a very, very strong warrior archetype. I might actually be able to find it on the table.
It is there, isn't it? It is there.
There we go. That's the card. I'll just might read it out for our viewers. So I've got to put the glasses on.
So this is your Carolyn May.
Okay, it's a Carolyn Myss card, and it says that the light attributes are strength, skill, discipline, toughness of will, heroism, self-sacrifice in conquering the ego. Then we have the shadow attributes, trading ethical principles for victory at any cost, or indifference to the suffering inflicted on others. I don't think my shadow attributes were indifference to the suffering inflicted on others, but I think where it got a little shadowy for me, I had to be a warrior to survive, because I did lose all my material possessions, and I had to bring up 2 little boys. I was pregnant at the time, and with a 2.5-year-old. And so, yeah, it was a difficult time. So I had to keep going. And that's this stoicism about the warrior, and I would never give up, but it was to the detriment to my own well-being, my own health. You know, I would never stop. I'd be up until late at night trying to work out how to do my marketing on the computer, these sorts of things. So, and there was it's almost like a whipping, you know, of this person, you know, to get the work done. You can't rest until it's done. And so I think that's the shadowy part of the warrior, you know, where they never give themselves any rest. And the thing that assisted me at the time was where I was introduced to, let's see if she's here. I think she's here. Well, there's a wounded child, but there's the mother. Yeah. So it was learning to connect with the mother archetype within myself, and she's about nurturance and patience and unconditional love, and joy in giving birth to life. And you know, once I reconnected with her, I could get that warrior under control. So it's like this work is quite profound for me, which is why, you know, I'm so glad that you're talking about it today, Paul.
Yeah, an archetype like your experience, like the warrior. And thank you, Kelly. That's beautiful that you shared that story and your experience of the archetypes on such a personal level with everybody. Obviously, that's been a very significant experience in your life, and a very good example of how we can be too close to an archetype, and it can consume us. And we then have 2 responses to the archetype. We either over-identify with it, or and that's what we call the active pole in Gillette's model, or we actually kind of really disidentify from it, but it unconsciously plays itself out in our lives anyway. So some people with the warrior maybe really feel like the warrior is everything, and some people may have a more passive position with that archetype, and one where it is to be underhandedly used in an immature form. Yeah. So the splitting that occurs can split the psyche with a particular identification with an archetype, because they're powerful forces, and they're not who we are. You know, we need an ego identity and an openness to what I've called earlier the transpersonal, or the field of consciousness, that we are able to kind of move a bit more freely amongst it and with the archetypes, and yet we're not the archetype.
Yeah. That's been my concern, that we can get caught up in the labels of each archetype. So how do we balance that, knowing that, well, we're so much more than that, we're so much deeper than that?
I think what you did was one way of balancing it. You find an archetype that's necessary and calling to be lived, and that becomes an expansion of yourself into that your sense of you came through more by also then being able to embrace the mother archetype, you know, and it brought through a softening of your identity in relation to the being so identified with the warrior, because obviously the mother archetype has a feature of wisdom and knowing and care, but connection. The warrior archetype has very little sense of connection. The warrior archetype fulfills what is deemed necessary by the queen or king energies,
right,
you know, within us, which are more the center of the psyche than the warrior is.
So they're more the structural side of creativity, would you say? That sovereign side of the archetypes?
Yes. Yeah. The warriors fulfills a mission. It fulfills the transpersonal vision of the king or queen. So the self is sort of like the moving in a direction where you feel you need to go. The warrior's job as an archetype is to help you to fulfill that. And the mother energy is a bit like the Empress in tarot, isn't it? It's like it's got that energy of the goddess or king, queen energy, depending on the identity.
And lover.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the loving of the self, and compassion to self. Yeah. Wow. This has been a beautiful conversation, Paul. And I know you have to go in a minute. so I'm thinking, is there anything else that you'd like to say about archetypes that you really think is important for people to understand before we close up today?
There's a couple of things we could talk about if you feel like you don't have to go.
No, I'm good. It is getting dark. Can you see the darkness around me?
A little bit, yeah. It comes through every now and again. So I think in terms of our collective situation at the moment, two of the most important features of the archetypes that we're dealing with are the child and the hero. The child in Jungian psyche has a lot to do with new beginnings. And I know that you've got a number of cards there of the child archetype as it's broken down by Carolyn Myss.
Yes, do you mind if I just show people? I'll just want to run through them. Carolyn Myss has spoken about, I'll just read them here. We've got I have to put my glasses back on, I'm sorry. We've got the divine child with the light attributes of innocence and purity and redemption, special connection with the divine. We then have the magical child with the light attributes of seeing the potential for sacred beauty in all things and the belief that everything is possible, which is gorgeous. And then we have the nature child. Boy, my two boys are they were nature children, but we can always maintain that archetype anyway as we grow into adults. The light attributes are friendships with animals and communication with nature spirits. And lastly, she talks about the eternal child with the light attributes of determination to remain young in body, which is really important if we're here to do the work as helpers. To mind and spirit, the ability to see things with fresh eyes. So that's like beginner's mind, I guess you could say, Paul.
Thank you. Yeah, see, that's how she's brought them to life, isn't it? Like she's really kind of broken down a core archetype into different facets there that we know the child has many dimensions, many different aspects within us. And ultimately, it's the vulnerable self and the gifted self. If people embrace the child, they're embracing their potential. Yeah, and yet they're also embracing the vulnerability and wounding that they might otherwise not connect into. Like the wonder child's quite different to the wounded child.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then there's the child in us that has a sense of adventure, and you can see it's linked to the hero, or heroine. That at this time, we have to learn to embrace the larger sense of identity. And it's and it's the act of being heroic on our own path, and yet embracing the child self, our identity that's sort of more human, more tender, more at risk in some ways. We have to learn how to hold kind of a balance here between our humanness and our more esoteric, spiritual, divine nature, which is the full embrace of the whole universal game. You know, I mean, Thomas More put it beautifully when he said he doesn't know any better symbol for the soul than the night sky. You know, it's like that whole universe of selves and of the patterns of consciousness that want to come through. It's a little bit like Michael Harner. You know, Michael said that, you know, if you just did a shamanic journey, you can experience anything that a mystic or a saint or other spiritual figure has ever experienced, just by the simple beat of a drum and dropping into that kind of consciousness that opens us into this realm of different features of what it means to be human, mythologically and greatly in life. Yeah. So if we're going to come through this archetype of the apocalypse that we're in right now, we have to do the work in order to come into the archetype of the self. That's the big thing, and that's a hero's journey of our time. And it does involve the child and the hero archetypes. You know, the archetype of the apocalypse is well written about in Jungian circles as being a force that divides people, that is wanting to be known. Yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean death and destruction, but it does mean that there are shadow dimensions coming through in our collective world at the moment that we've refused to integrate and that are coming at us in the wrong way.
What do you think it needs, Paul?
What does it need?
Yes.
It needs consciousness.
Yep.
It needs awareness. It needs to be integrated, because only then can we step into the collective archetype of the self, which the archetype of the apocalypse, Jung said, precedes the self. It precedes the coming of the self collectively, which you hear talked about in terms of things like a new world or a new earth. Yeah. It's a sort of a new embrace of the paradisal or paradise-like realm that humanity actually knew when heaven and earth were much more integrated. We lost that. It's coming back. But the only way for it to come back is for us to resolve what we've refused to look at, what we refuse to face, and to not have that opportunity stolen from us by anything that refuses consciousness. We can't afford to be rigid at a time like this. We need to continue to open to the energies that want to come through and be our true self at the same time. So that gets us from the apocalyptic energy into the self. Yeah. And it's a collective thing. Everybody has to get onto it. But Jung said, in fact, that if there were enough people doing it, we could get through. You know, yeah. So it's sort of
I imagine most of the population will be doing this unconsciously anyway, over in years to come.
If they're feeling people, that's a contribution. If they're refusing to feel, then they're falling into narcissism. They're falling into a refusal for that transformation to occur, in which case, well, one day we'll come around again and face it all again if we don't work it through this time.
And before we finish off today, if you'd like to just touch on the new human, I think you've mentioned to me before that there's a new archetype coming through, which might be embodied by some of the little, I call them star seeds, the new souls coming through.
Thanks, Kelly. This is really, my first concept of this and sense of this came from a lovely bloke whose name is John Woodcock, who was a Jungian analyst who gave a presentation on Jung's work and the unknown heritage of Jung's work. And he actually put through the idea that there's like a new creative coming through that he has sometimes called, I think, the animal soul. Basically, it's like his idea is that there is a new archetype coming through in human consciousness, which you could call the new human. And he felt that Jung's life showed this new archetype, because Jung actually loved to do creative stuff, like making symbolic things, like his home, the tower, and his own creative inner work. That new human seems to be an individual that is prepared to be heroic in being who they are, and be creative and connect with that realm that we just spoke about of heaven and earth. It's like we're bringing ordinary consciousness and this new consciousness that wants to come through together. That's an archetypal journey and a new identity. Yeah, these new identities, yeah, they tend to not feel like they actually fit too well, and that's true because they are they're grounding this in the world now. They're bringing it through in their way of being and in their own natures that they're born into. Yeah, they just carry that archetype as part of their, I guess, their intrinsic makeup that they come through with in this life. Yeah, I think the sensitives, the indigo children, those sorts of figures that are finding it, they have that exceptionality about them, and they're learning to be that in a whole way. That's my sense of that archetype that John Woodcock was talking about. And I sometimes call it the Integral Neo Shaman, because it's like we have to embrace all levels of reality: body, emotion, mind, body, mind, soul, spirit. And we have to be able to embrace the energies of connection with all the animals, all life, and in the universe. And that's the shaman or magician figure that does that. Very important. It was the magician figure in the king or queen's court that always set the king or queen straight when they were losing their direction, when their governance wasn't accurate and wasn't what it needed to be in the world. It was the magician that sorted the king and queen out and that put them back on track so that they were in their right energy of connecting to spirit and living for the good of all. Yeah, that's all archetypal stuff. Yeah.
Oh, well, Paul, look, I've loved this conversation, and I know it's just so expansive, where we can go with this. And I'm sure that everyone out there that's listened to this has really enjoyed it as well. So I just want to thank you so much for coming in today. It's been such a pleasure having you again on my show. And I hope that you'll come back again and talk maybe a little more about some of those other dimensions out there where a lot of us experience things, whether it's while we're asleep or sometimes people will actually have the experiences when they're awake and they're actually taken. So if you're open to talking about that, we can have part 3.
Well, that would be an honour. Look, Stephanie and I, my wife and I, we love what you're doing, and it's a privilege to be represented here as part of what you're developing and conveying the new human to a growing audience. And we wish you well with that. And we're really honoured to be a part of it.
Thank you so much. And so a big thank you to Stephanie, and I'm going to get her on too eventually. All right. Thanks so much again, Paul.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Thank you, Kelly. Bye-bye.